Hello and welcome to Hare and the Hawthorn. It's nice to have you back and it's nice to be back. We've got a returning guest today. Yes, we know we're going to get to the goblet, don't worry. Before we begin today, I have to mention this because we are super excited about this. Well, I certainly am. I don't know how excited Neil is about it. So we are also on, not only on YouTube, but we're also on the Ghost Planet Network. So that's a channel that you can find on the Tinternet. I would say I'd put a link below, but you all know how crap I am with technology and it will never ever happen. So go and find it yourself. That's all I can say. I'm sorry. So the Ghost Planet Network have this year put out awards for different podcasts, and me and Neil are up for one. We're up for an award. I'm going to go along to the award ceremony on Saturday. So this is the last week in June. Unfortunately, Neil's tuxedo is in the dry cleaners, so he can't join me. So I'll be having him on video phone, and he will join me as a little tiny phone person when I was going to say when we win. Then I don't know whether we're going to win. I don't care whether we win or not. I'm over the moon that we're up for this award. So just wanted to mention that, and that comes from the Haunted Antique Centre in Leicester. So if you haven't been to check that out and you like all things spooky, get yourself over to the Haunted Antique Centre. So shameless plug for you guys there. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to make a quick mention beforehand about the said fairy goblet that we are still running that competition for. We have come into our British summertime. So at some point, probably the next episode, we will be revealing what Neil has in his fairy goblet. So, you know, you'll be put out your misery pretty soon.
And
anyway,
before we go on any further, I don't want any smart Alex saying it's adrenochrome again. You know, so
no, it wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't. It was Gelfling, something or other, blood, or it wasn't quite that kind of, you know, ball type area of things. It was something a little less. Something a little less. Well, yeah, we're going into dark realms already. So I apologise. I apologise to our guest. We've got a returning guest, and this guy boggles my mind. I have been dipping in and out of the one book of his that I've purchased. I daren't purchase any more just yet, and no disrespect. It's because getting through our guest's work is like expanding your consciousness about all things paranormal, and bringing it out and bringing it back in and connectivity, and it just boggles my mind. So the last time that Joshua Cutchin was on with us, we were discussing this book here, Ecology of Souls, and this is a book that I genuinely go out and promote within the paranormal community. If people want to look at the subject holistically and look at the subject maybe from a different viewpoint, it's mind-bending, it's brilliant, and I absolutely love it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Neil, who's going to give a formal introduction to today's guest.
Yeah, Joshua, you're not going to get a word in today. It's 5 minutes in and you haven't said a word. So yes, I think Joshua was on with us maybe 18 months ago, 20 months ago, just after Ecology of Souls came out, and we discussed that. So we're not going to be discussing that too much today, but I just want to just make viewers who are not aware of Joshua's work how much he's actually put out. Ecology of Souls was your last book, wasn't it? Well, no, actually, this was Joshua's last.
Yeah. Actually, there's the novel that you did the blurb for.
No. We're coming to that. I'm talking about non-fiction. Don't worry. The
non-fiction stuff. Yeah,
is first up, but non-fiction. So fairy films, which I had an article in as well. Joshua edited and contributed to it. Brilliant book. You know, that's the most recent. But let me just quickly, you know, just so viewers get an idea of how prolific Joshua's been in a range of subjects. I'll go backward in time. After Ecology of Souls, that's 2022. Before that, he wrote a book called Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon in 2020. That's 2 volumes, and I have that as an ebook. And I was never really interested in the Bigfoot phenomenon before I read this, and I was kind of reluctant to get this book. I'm afraid to say, Joshua, because it's Bigfoot, Sasquatch. But having read it, I've changed my mind completely. I'd thoroughly recommend getting that one. Before that, I think this was how I was introduced to Joshua. Thieves in the Night, A Brief History of Supernatural Child Abduction. So there's lots in there, obviously, about fairy, changelings, etc. But it goes beyond that, and that was 2018. So that's when I first came across Joshua, and I thought, oh, right, this guy's interesting. But before that, and this is in 2016, this is the best title ever for a book: The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. How did you come up with that title? That's absolutely outrageous. And then before that, and these are the books that Joshua's authored. He's contributed to loads of things, but I'm just, Joshua's the main author. And 2015, A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. That's the only one of yours that I haven't read. I'll have to get hold of that. But so just to give you an idea of what a prolific non-fiction author Joshua is. But we want to start off today. We're already 10 minutes in, aren't we? We're waffling on a bit today. Before we get into that, as we get into this, Them Always Never Died, a novel by Joshua Cutchin. And it's a big one, madam. And I was privileged to read this before publication because Joshua sent me for comments, and so I could put a little blurb on the back. And I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to leave Joshua because it's very easy to give spoilers for this book, and I don't want to give the spoilers. So if Joshua does it, that's his problem. but let me just read out. Oh my goodness! If I'll just read out what I said. Very, very brief thing on the back of the book. Them Old Ways Never Died is a magisterial tale of redemption realized through the prison of folklore, but revolving around the skewed, secularized perspectives of the 21st century. It is a story cemented in reality and ventilated by the otherworld. It is sinister, disquieting, and eldritch, but also an exquisite paean to the human spirit and the beauty of absolution. So that's enough of me. Tell us, give us a resume of what the book is about, Joshua, and then afterwards, hopefully, I want to talk a little bit about how you swap between non-fiction and fiction, and how you integrate, these ideas into a fictional novel.
Well, the first thing I have to do is massage my face because I've been smiling so hard for the first 10 minutes here. It's always wonderful to connect with y'all. I have such a special resonance with people who consider themselves first and foremost fairyists, and I don't know if y'all feel of yourselves that way, but
Oh, yeah.
there's such a kindred spirit there, and it allows us to leapfrog over a lot of the other stuff that I have to talk about on other shows. Like, there's no getting people up to speed. What was the question?
Them Old Ways Never Died. What it is about? Obviously,
Right.
It's got to be brief. No spoilers if you can manage it, and
Right.
and then we'll expand on that in terms of the writing process.
Well, we'll see how we deal with the no spoilers question. But I'd always wanted to write something fictional, even though I'd sort of had so much experience with the nonfiction stuff. I always thought that there was an opportunity to reach people in a different way with some things through fiction. But the main thing that was holding me back is that I always really enjoy films that are not just about the text. Like, there's an actual subtext going on there where you can almost on a one-to-one ratio swap out people and places and plot devices for other things pertaining to the human condition, I guess. And I never really had a good idea that could encompass that until I started playing with this particular idea in February of, oh my goodness, it was probably December of 2022. I had just gotten off of releasing Ecology of Souls, and as you can imagine from something that massive, the idea of doing another nonfiction project right away was not appealing to me at all because of the end notes. I think Ecology of Souls, both volumes together, have about 4,200 end notes, and just it's a monumental task trying to juggle all that. I'm like, what if I just wrote something where I didn't have to cite anything, and I just sort of got had this ability to let things flow. What I didn't realize is that fiction presents its own obstacles because there's that little cursor blinking on the screen at you, and it's all going to come from you. Or not from you. That's another topic that we could talk about where these ideas come from. But so I finally settled on an idea that I thought had a degree of resonance, that I saw some really interesting parallels. Obviously, if anybody knows my work, I'm going to probably write about fairies and probably write about the intersection between fairies and extraterrestrials, UFOs, alien abductions, that sort of thing. And it's always kind of interesting to me how alien abductions seem to mirror a bad hangover. It's like you've got missing time, and your body aches, and you might have strange wounds that you weren't aware of, and all these things. And that, combined with my own experience being in recovery for alcoholism, it seemed like that was a place to play a little bit. So people say write what you know about. So it's a novel filled with fairy lore set in North Georgia with a musician as the central character. So those are all things that feature prominently in my life. But it really was liberating to play with some of these ideas in different ways, and to actually like deal with issues of symbols. There's a recurring symbol of a salmon, the idea of salmon in the book, and a couple of other recurring symbols that I thought really spoke to some of the themes. And uh, quite frankly, I mean, sometimes I wonder if writing it wasn't my own sort of therapy session to continue expressing these ideas and having them coalesced. When I was in rehab in August of 2020, I wrote like a madman. Just it filled up an entire notebook, and a lot of those ideas made their ways in some shape or form into Them Old Ways Never Died, just to preserve them. But also, I have enough friends who are authors themselves of fiction, and I kept on hearing these things that I wanted to experience myself. And since I'm kind of crap at having experiences, generally speaking, that's changed a little bit lately, but generally speaking, the number of experiences I've had are pretty limited. I felt like the novel might be a sort of conjuration in the sense that I could have some of these experiences on demand. And the types of things that I was specifically looking for that did end up happening to me were these constant illusions that I would hear from my author friends about, like, oh, well, if you write a character that's well-rounded enough, they start telling you things, and they start telling you what they will do and won't do. And I'm like, I really want to experience that. And it was always fascinating to me because even some of my authors with sort of an atheistic bent would have that sort of same sentiment about some of these things. So I was like, okay, I want to see what that's like. And sure enough, I did experience a lot of that. Something that happened over the course of writing it was kind of hell to try to go to sleep, because it would be that right when you're starting to fall asleep is when the best solution to a problem that you've been trying to figure out all day just comes into your head, and then you have to roll over and type it out on your phone or write it down, and then now you're starting the process of falling asleep again. But that's exactly what I was asking for, and that's exactly what I got. So it's out now. It's coming up on a year, and it was definitely something that I wrote for myself. And I feel like my life has been enriched by getting to know some of the people in that novel, because they have a very lived aspect in my life ever since. Yeah.
So they become sort of sort of archetypal sections of who you are. Was that the therapy?
I mean, yeah, there's certainly an argument to be made that two of the main characters, Rick and Devlin, are kind of like me and my shadow, or are aspects of me. There's certainly an argument to be made there, and sort of the way that they bounce off of each other is a bit of my internal monologue. I didn't necessarily intend that, but a lot of these things happen that way. Like, there are plenty of things that just you never intended to wind up in there, that do wind up in there. And sort of navigating that was interesting. Putting these people that I would love to see sort of up against each other, because you've got like one person who's a true agnostic, one person who's an ardent believer but kind of a cynic, another person who's a skeptic, and another person who's a non-cynical believer, and sort of having those four different characters through the middle section of the book in the same room. The dialogue kind of ended up writing itself for sure.
Brilliant.
Yeah, it really is. It is a good read. I do not read much modern fiction. It's once you've read the 19th and 20th century classics, it's like, well, nothing's going to compete with them, and I just
Very
can't.
true.
I just can't be bothered. But this caught me, and I have to say, Joshua, I've said this to you before. When you sent me the text and the PDF, and I saw how many pages, I thought, oh, Josh, what have you done?
I
This
know.
is not. You can't. It's not War and Peace. You can't do this.
Yes,
It's
no, I totally
uh,
agree.
and but then and I've told you this before privately, but it's as soon as I got into it, it was like, nah, it needs to be this long, because
Well,
it needs to breathe,
it
and
yeah.
the build up is necessarily that long.
There are a couple things that are sort of encoded, because I've seen some people. It's the feedback has generally been very positive, which I've been very grateful for. Some people have said that some parts are a little bit repetitive, and there is sort of a length issue there. But like a substantial portion of this book is about the main character's inner dialogue during the pandemic, and I think you kind of have to have that space and that repetition to sort of drive home what a lot of us were going through. Because in addition to summarizing my own recovery process and whatnot. I know so many people. I'm a musician and I do the writing, right? So at least I had something else to fall back on in 2020 when the world shut down. But I have a lot of friends who didn't teach and were just performers, and I really wanted to commemorate and preserve in amber the way that that felt for a lot of people, which I didn't have the full experience of because I had other interests, but I thought it was worthwhile sort of having a living record of what it was like in that process. So that's part of the reason for the length. That's part of the reason that there's a section in the middle during that pandemic-y portion that gets a little bit repetitive. But the other thing that I think really, if I can, say why I think it works as long as it is that I think that a lot of different media nowadays have problems with pacing. So I've always been sort of a cinephile. I grew up in a household where my dad had subscribed to the trades, like we got Daily Variety and
Hmm.
stuff sent to the mailbox. So like the craft aspect of like movie making was always really interesting to me, and pacing is not enough of an emphasis in film is placed on pacing as I think that there should be. And so I had a couple of mandates where like if you sit down and you sort of divide the book into a 4-act structure, um, which a lot of 3-act structures are derivative of, there is a very clear quarter of the way through point, halfway point, 3/4 of the way point, where something changes. That, and the fact that I think there's maybe one or two chapters out of all the chapters in the book where nothing unexplained or anomalous happens. Every other chapter, there's one thing that happens that's weird, and I felt like that was sort of a good way, in that sort of, I guess, R.L. Stine sort of way, to
Yep.
keep people pushing forward. So hopefully, it's reassuring to know that sort of paid off with making it easy to get through because it is a little bit long. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think of that as you used the word repetition. It's not. It just made it more realistic. I mean,
Mm,
some fiction and some films, obviously drama, it'll just be just boom, 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 or we've got to get to the denouement of what we're talking about. No, just slow it down. Give us some pace. Give us some inner dialogue. Think,
yeah.
what was this person thinking? And Rick, who's really the main character, yeah. No, I found myself, when you're reading a book, you're nodding your head. Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I've
Yeah.
done that. I've been
Yeah.
an idiot. I've been an idiot like that. Um,
Yeah.
but one no, and when you asked me to write the little piece for the back, and I sent it, and the one thing you said, no, I'm going to have to take out the word fairies, because you didn't
Right.
want to give the book. But for someone reading the book, I think we're okay here. We're amongst friends here,
Right.
and
Right.
like, people know that it's going to be about fairies, and the fairies, and do you want to just talk about how you develop them? Because these fairies are, you know, that, well, the word I use, that it's disquieting. They're disquieting. You've plugged into the proper sort of black negative, not negative, sort of scary side of fairy folklore, and just brought it in gradually and gradually. And some of it is pretty terrifying, I have to say. And so, how did you do that? Why did you do that?
Well, I really genuinely appreciate that. I mean, I see so much of modern fairy fiction. Um, it just it doesn't really resonate with me that much at all. Is it the urban fantasy, or is that
Yeah,
the
yeah,
genre? Yeah, and
yeah, yeah.
it just plays a little bit fast and loose with the folklore, and it it incorporates a little bit too much of all the stuff that we cringe at as fairy scholars, you know what I mean? And I was like, well, what would happen if you actually like tried to be as faithful as possible? And yeah, there are a couple of places where I sort of gloss some things and elide some things and play a little bit with some stuff, but for the most part, I tried to be really, really faithful to that stuff. And you know, some of my favorite fairy fictions, probably two of my favorite fictions are Labyrinth,
Yes.
which in its own way, probably pulled along by those Brian Froud designs,
Mhm.
does a pretty good job of sort of imparting that sense as well. But also Queen of Morning, King of Day. Is that right? I always mix it up. I always mix it up because it's, let's see, Queen of Morning. I might have those backwards. It's King of Morning, Queen of Day. I
King
remember
of,
that. But
right.
it's by Ian McDonald, and it's a wonderful book that is an intergenerational story of the way that this phenomenon follows these multiple generations of women in Ireland. And so you can sort of start to see the generational aspect in Them Old Ways Never Died if you look at that as well. Um, but you know, sort of bringing the idea of some of this fairy folklore into the modern age um, while not presenting it in a silly way. Because I mean, let's face it, some of these older stories are a bit silly. If you actually have I couldn't write a changeling scene where the character is in the room and the changeling goes, the acorn before the earth I need, you know, it's a little bit too, so, but at the same time I wanted to preserve that. So like finding places like that where you can share that story the way so many of these stories are already shared, you know, secondhand. You're not having to have the character describe what they're hearing or seeing. Another good example is the father's expedition to the fairy fort when he sees like all sorts of different varieties of fairies. I wanted to sort of touch on the multitude of shapes these things take, but doing that can be kind of hard. There's a scene later where you get sort of Hieronymus Bosch style depiction of the faithful. But you know, so all these things, trying to pull them together and present them in oblique ways when possible, to sort of give them a little bit more authenticity, I think was important. And also, you know, pulling them into some of my own suspicions about these topics, ideas of the unconscious, and how whatever this thing looking back at us seems to be, it seems to be operating from a place beyond time and space. Like, how do you depict that in a novel in that sort of form? And I did some stuff that worked for me. You know, it might not work for everybody, but that was a big part of it too. And then you know, I mentioned uh, Labyrinth, and you know,
Yes.
David Bowie's portrayal of the Goblin King, and I was like, well, I want to have a leader for the fairies. Who's it going to be? And I'm like, well, I don't want to do a Goblin King. How about a Fairy Queen? And I'm like, who would be if do you know who the Fairy
Mm,
Queen is in my head casting? Anybody?
go on. Go on. Go on.
It's Tilda Swinton. It's 100% Tilda Swinton. Who you know
Oh,
yeah
ah,
that was like, who would play her? Who would play the Fairy Queen? And you know, Tilda played Bowie at one point in a film, so it was like that seemed like it had some resonance too. So these are just all the little bits and bobs that I tried to put into a blender and see what came out the other side. And
And so what about I mean we're saying, you know, well, fairy folklore, but it does have a very, you haven't just sort of lifted a load of Irish and Scottish or British folklore and dumped it in the Appalachians, haven't you? There's a very distinct flavour of that you know, that particular area of America that flavors not just the character, not just the human characters, but the non-human characters as well. I when they turned up, I thought, yeah, they're American fairies then.
Yeah,
That wouldn't be happening in England.
yeah, yeah.
Were you thinking along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly some of that. Well, it's this idea, like, let's take for granted the idea that whatever they were and however they did it, fairies came over with um, settlers to the U.S. How did they interact with what was already here, and how did they sort of, using a fancy word, how did they syncretize and sort of combine in that fashion or form and fashion? And there is a passage in the book where that I think in hindsight I'm kind of proud of the way that I did it, because I think it says a lot, where someone who is familiar with the fairies of Ireland is in the US, and they start seeing basically Native Americans out of dime store novels in in the Appalachian area, and only then later are they like, oh, well, the Cherokee don't really dress like that. So what are these people that I'm seeing? And it's this idea that they're drawing on cultural expectations and all that sort of baggage, and then trying to keep it. The other thing that I think really helps is, and I think George R. R. Martin spoke about this in some form or fashion, but don't make the mystical mechanistic, don't really try to pin down a bunch of rules about how things do and don't work. Be consistent with it, but at the same time, don't come out and be like, well, you can never cast a fire spell in the rain or something, something that, literal or explicit. Try to sort of have your own internal logic and present that in these oblique ways that people can sort of intuit if you do it right. Is another part of that as well. And there is that sort of flavor. I mean, I don't think that, while it isn't true that old world fairy folklore stopped on the east coast of America, it definitely is stronger here, and it's actually quite strong in New England. But there's sort of this the perseverance of fairy lore in the Appalachian region, I think, has been severely underappreciated for a long time. I'm really looking forward to what Morgan Daimler puts together with their new book on North American fairy belief. But I think it's been really underappreciated. So being able to sort of tug on that as well, and get a little bit of that sort of Southern Gothic feeling into
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, that's the term, isn't it? Southern
Before,
Gothic.
before you jump in, Neil, I've just got to say, when you were talking about the Americanization of the European fairy, I just had this clear image of a Devonshire pixie with a cowboy hat and boots on. Can you explain about a little more about what that means? What does that look like? How does that take on mannerisms and behaviours within fairies? How do they differ when they become Americanized to the European sort of counterparts?
Well, I would argue that they're a bit more. Well, it's tricky. It's a tricky thing to talk about, because you have these sort of existing Native American myths about the little people, which are in some cases shockingly similar to what you would see in your part of the world. But I think that a lot of times there's something a little bit more covert about American fairy lore, in terms of the fact that it seems to really enjoy wearing different masks more than it does in the old world. And I think it is more apt to hide behind the UFO mask, but also, with America's special place in, Christian fundamentalism and stuff like that, it loves hiding behind the demon mask a lot as well, I think. So I think fairy folklore is not only in America because it's a melting pot, but I think that it's gone underground to a certain degree because it's a melting pot and has all these different folklores that it can hide within, and that it sort of tends to pick and choose what aspects of which folklore it can it prefers. I mean, this is something that I run into with my nonfiction writing. Is like, I'll be talking about the disappearance of a hiker with German ancestry in Manitoba, and the things that will happen around their disappearance I'll find in folklore from like Ghana or something. It's like, why
Yeah.
is this folklore from a part of the world that's not at all related to the place or the person who disappeared manifesting there? But like sometimes it'll get really exact, and that's not a specific example. That's just a broader illustration of the sort of things that I run into. And the only thing that I can figure is that there is sort of a separation from time and space that the good folk or these things in general, writ large, whatever you want to call them, seem to capitalize on and
Yeah.
like to play with. And I
Yeah.
think that there's something about that sort of American background that was strengthened by the indigenous folklore, but also is being kept alive by this mixture of cultures that we have.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that kind of reinforces the idea of whatever the fairies are, wherever they come from, they seem to be in a non-material, standalone reality of some sort, and
Yes.
that necessarily is global or even universal, you could say. And so, although there may be different characteristics in different parts of the world, that's probably down to the human consciousness that is experiencing them,
Right.
rather than what they are. And
Right.
which oh, that's such a beautiful segue to what I want to talk about next, Joshua. Before I do, just once again, go and buy it. You'll love it. Them Always Never Died. Absolutely fantastic novel. Thank you. You know, we've expanded so much more about.
Well, and thank you for your involvement in it, and for the kind words, not only then when you blurbed it, but now as well.
Brilliant.
You know, it means a lot.
I've got
Yeah.
to go out and buy it now, and it's got to be a movie by the sounds of it.
It would make a movie. It's when I was reading it, I was thinking I don't always do this, but I'm picturing scenes as movie scenes, and it's like, yeah, this could be translated into a movie.
I think some of it gets a little unfilmable for copyright purposes towards the end, but
yeah. Well, you know,
you know, you can find a way around
a
that.
movie maker would just have to chop certain aspects of that.
100%. Yeah.
But as viewers who don't know Joshua will have probably realized by now, is that one thing that Joshua wrote, especially in Ecology of Souls, is about the fairy phenomenon being such a broad church. That's a bad term, isn't it, church? But you know what I mean by a broad church that encompasses Sasquatch, all sorts of other cryptozoology, UFOs, ghosts, the dead. There's a massive melting pot here, and like I was just saying about a standalone reality, they're all, for me, I've become increasingly convinced that everything is coming from the same place, and it's just how it interacts with human consciousness that makes it what it is. And what I want to do now, I just want to read. It's from the new fairy census by Simon Young, which came out at the end of last year, the second census, with about 500 entries in this one, as there were in the first.
Thank you, Simon.
Yes, it's mammoth. It's mammoth.
It's an absolute empirical work, a massive work that Simon, and he's very modest about. There you go. That's just one volume. There's 3 volumes. Oh, all right, case left.
I'm not.
Three volumes, and so
There's actually 4 volumes. Have you got them all?
Yeah. No, you're right. 4 volumes with the
4 blinking volumes of this. It's
when I become president, I'm not going to promise a house in every car in every garage. I'm going to promise a fairy census in every library.
It's what everyone needs. You're absolutely right. It's a monumental work, and I'm writing an article about the second census at the moment, and it's very, very noticeable. 2 things are noticeable. There are more entries from the US in consideration of what we've just been talking about, and there are many more entries which go into more detail. People seem a little bit more comfortable now than they did back in 2017, whenever the first one came out, in talking a little bit more about the experience in detail. And I just want to read this one out that I came across yesterday, because it will take us into 2-3 different directions for the rest of the podcast. So this is number 615, and it's from Yorkshire, England, and it's from the 2010s. Doesn't say the exact year, so it's between 2010 and 2020. A female in her 20s, and so it's not very long. But let me just just read it out, and then we can discuss with Joshua. So it's in open land, fields, etc., on a country road. She's on her own. 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. Joyful, occasional supernatural experiences, no special state reported. Loss of sense of time, profound silence before the experience, unusually vivid memories of the experience, a sense that the experience marked a turning point in my life. All things which recurring themes. So this is the incident. I was driving home from a business trip. I live in a very rural part of North Yorkshire. I was driving over moorland when my car stalled and stopped. She's going to be abducted by UFOs, surely. No, everything cut out. In the distance, I could see what looked like lanterns approaching me. They got closer and closer, and suddenly it became light as day. A fairy procession came into view with the king and queen on black horses. Their manes swept the ground. Behind them came a long line of fairies, some playing instruments. Once they passed me, my ignition cut in and my car came back to life. They varied. Those at the front in line were quite beautiful, and those at the back were more soberly dressed, and their features were not so well defined. The hypnotic pipes and flutes were prominent. Old-fashioned music. I live in the Yorkshire Dales, designated place of outstanding beauties, rolling hills and more. So yes, it could be associated with fairies, but I've never heard of any recent or confirmed sightings. I've seen many spirits. In fact, I was part of a church deliverance team, but I'd never experienced fairies before. What are fairies? I honestly don't know, but I do know what I saw. What I experienced was real. They were not the figment of my imagination. They paid no attention to me whatsoever. I know that they were very real because my car died on me. I was a little afraid as they came closer and locked my car doors. They passed in their own time, and only after they passed did my car start up again. I was shaking, and so drove home slowly. Go on then, Joshua, what do you make of that? Is that a UFO abduction phenomenon, or is it a fairy incident?
There are some people I know who would be like, "Oh, it was the extraterrestrials putting in a screen memory of little people," and I'm like, "No, just no." I mean, I, I, I think we obsess too much on the exact way that these things manifest, and not all the other things that happen. I mean, in a lot of the fairy census, the most important things to me are those first bits that are summarized at the beginning of every encounter, right? You know, the feelings that the person had, their experience with these things in the past, like all these things play into this to the extent that it's like, well, however it manifested kind of doesn't matter. It's more of the stuff that happens, like again, the car stoppage. I mean, you know, that veil of silence is a very Jenny Randall's Oz effect sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting because for the longest time I wasn't sure how often that engine stoppage, arrested journey aspect that you see in UFO phenomenon appeared in the fairy stuff, because so many of those fairy stories that we know from Evans Wentz and stuff are pre-electric. I mean, I think that if memory serves, it wasn't until the 1940s that a lot of parts of rural Ireland were electrified at all. So like you can't really deal with the electric interference thing as much as you can, but to see a story like that, it's like, no, that aspect of the UFO phenomenon appears in the fairy stuff as well. You know, I just it's lovely, and it also, I think, if you could choose to interpret it as one of those Exodus of the fairy stories, you know, and you don't get a ton of those nowadays. I don't feel like, which is really, What year was that again?
It was didn't give the exact year. It was between 2010 and 2020.
Okay,
so
yeah,
very recent.
Very recent, yeah.
Very recent.
Yeah.
That was just one that really struck me. Partly because you can also tell with the person who's writing the report, you can tell whether they're authentic or not. I find that came across. It's completely authentic. You can just tell that she had this experience, not quite able to experience it, never experienced fairies before, but oh well, I think this was fairies, and yet she's as you just say, you know, that whole aspect of processing fairies, you know, the king and queen, even the black horse, you know, these are all a big folkloric element motifs, and she didn't seem to know that, and yet she's incorporating it within that report,
which is what I love. Like when I find a story from a farmer in Nebraska who mentions something out of an old Mesopotamian text, I'm like, that's really interesting, you know. But but the other thing that I think is really interesting is what you mentioned at the start too about, people being more comfortable with this stuff and being more expressive about this stuff. I've noticed that everywhere I've gone.
Mm.
Even in my church, people are super open to talking about things like UFOs and whatnot. And there's a segment of the population that would say, "Oh, that's because the United States Congress had these congressional hearings about UFOs and such." But I'm like, no, that's a symptom. That's not the cause of this. That's a symptom. And as terrifying a time as it is to be alive, which I think we could all agree on, it's also exciting to kind of see us shifting into this era when these ideas are taken seriously and entertained by, quite frankly, normal people on the street. Like, I love y'all, but I don't think any of us three are normal people. But
no, we are perfectly normal. It's everybody else who's strange. Yeah, that's the one.
But I talk to people about the UFO question too, and they'll say things like, "Well, I don't think that they're aliens visiting us. I think they're interdimensional." And I'm like, "Whoa!" I mean, the '70s just called. Like, where did that come from? So it is exciting in that regard, and I guess it's nice to have a front row seat for that, among other things. But
Can I just jump in? I'm seriously mindful of time, and I do want to discuss this topic with you because it's something that Neil and I have been discussing, and it's becoming one of my bugbearing topics, and I'm hoping you can throw some different light onto the subject. And it kind of ties in with what you were saying with the labyrinth and the use of David Bowie as the Goblin King, because he was, very modern and iconic, and obviously, very famous musician at the time. I had a conversation, I'm just going to slip this in here. I had a conversation with a student of mine about 10 years ago, and he was a massive Labyrinth fan. He was the only kid of that era that I found that loved the Labyrinth. And we sat and discussed one afternoon who we would have as the cast of a new Labyrinth.
Oh my goodness.
And so we came up with the conclusion, and it's probably not who I'd choose now, but we decided there would be a Goblin Queen, and Adele would be a brilliant Goblin Queen.
That would be a good choice too.
I'm sorry, I'm leaving.
He's off.
Adele.
I don't particularly. It's not my thing, and I don't like it. But I just thought for theatrics, I thought should suit that kind of thing. Which brings me on to something that Neil and I have been discussing. I've also been discussing it with other, fairy people, if you like, about fairy music, and has it just stopped in a particular era, and why? Or is it because we don't interpret more modern music as fairy music? What do you think is the starting point?
Just before you go, Joshua, that report that I just read out, that's pretty typical when people talk about fairy music. It's flutes, it's all ethereal, and it's all a little bit Celtic folky. Is that right? Is it frozen in time? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because if you so many times in some of the older stories, you hear them just saying, music that can't be described or music from beyond this world, and you still get that in the UFO stuff. You still got it in the contactee stuff of the 50s and 60s, and you still get it in a lot of near-death experience reports and in trip reports. And because I think that we tend to gravitate as a modern culture towards those things more than we do fairies, maybe it's just been misinterpreted in some degree or another. I feel like because it's the punchline, right? Oh, of course I think aliens are real, because it's not like it's a leprechaun. Like it's the punchline effect, right? Like we've relegated these things so far down our list of possibilities that we don't even entertain that might be the source. But people do still hear strange music in the forest and such. It's one of those things that makes you wonder if fairy music, if the modes of producing fairy music have updated themselves, would they even be recognized as fairy music at all? I mean, this is one of the central conundrums that I have regarding fairy folklore is, we tend to think of a lot of modern sightings as featuring, people in medieval peasant garb, right? But they've been wearing that since there were medieval peasants. So it's like the fashion just got sort of arrested in one point in time. Has the music done that too? I don't know. It's a good question. I think that there are enough similarities between stuff like, again, that near-death experience music is the one that always sticks out to me, because you can sort of switch those out with some descriptions of the fairy music and get the exact same. They're indistinguishable from one another. But and sort of, so is the NDE sort of like a trance? And you hear about people falling asleep, and that's where Danny Boy came from,
Yeah.
hearing the melody, and so it was like, was that sort of the same space that someone was going to or something? I really don't know.
I mean,
The
we've
sorry,
discussed, we've discussed quite a lot of theories, and one of the theories that we've talked about is the recognizable nature of fairy music, and how, if we hear that something ethereal and harp-like and what we think is beautiful, we would instantly go, oh, it must be fairy music.
Right.
However, if we hear something that's like banging techno in that same environment,
Right.
we're not going to go, oh, that's fairy music.
Right.
But I mean, one of the notions that I have is, the fairies are very well documented for being kind of gifting musicians songs and abilities to be, to play instruments and to sing beyond measure of the human world. And it's, did they stop? Did they stop influencing musicians? Did they just leave, that creativity of humans behind? And I genuinely don't think they did. I like to think of them raving. That's what I like to think of them.
no,
Dancing to banging techno.
No, I'm going to repeat something completely from the last podcast that we did, but again, pointing to
Yes.
my post of the magnificent fields of the Nephilim, and I went and looked up the interview that Carl McCoy did that I was telling you about last time, and what he says is that, asked where's the music coming from, he says it's being channeled through elementals, but never explains anything beyond that. The interviewer goes off onto another subject. It's being channeled through elementals. What did he mean? So there you go. Fields of the Nephilim is fairy music. What do you think?
I think that I think too, like, I don't think it might be a third option. It might not be that they've stopped making music, or that we don't recognize it. It just may be the fact that we're not most of us aren't capable of recognizing it anymore.
Yes.
I mean, an idea that I've been playing with, speaking of Appalachia and sort of bringing these ideas full circle, one of the weirdest states in the U.S. has to be West Virginia. I mean, the concentration of cryptids and UFO sightings, and even some fairy stuff in that particular state is fascinating to me. And I've turned this over in my head, and the only thing that I can really arrive at is that there are people there in that state who are living in something much more aligned with the way that we used to live. You have families that occupy these hollers, and everybody knows everybody in that small, close-knit community. There are some, I was watching a documentary, there are some of these hollers that have phone service like a couple of days of the week, and the rest of the week they just don't have landline service, to say nothing of cell phone service. So there's something about like being in closer relation to the earth that I think facilitates, or being closer in relation to the way that we used to live, that facilitates being able to interact in this way. I mean, there's a wonderful bit of correspondence between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, where Tolkien speculates that it might even be the food that we're consuming that's not allowing us to sort of have that connection to the land and the genus loci that are there. Like, nowadays you're eating, here in the US, I'm eating avocados from Mexico and tomatoes from California. I'm not eating anything from where I am, so of course I'm not in touch with the energies that are here. And I think that's a really intriguing idea as well. And if that's the case, then it makes sense that we just don't hear music. And when we do, if you're a weirdo creative type like some of us are, then you're much more inclined to say, well, I don't know where it came from. I'll ascribe it to something else. Or also, the pull of ego. Oh, it came from me. It came from me. I'm not sure that's always the case.
Yeah.
Talking of such, going back to that notion, when you were writing, fictional stuff, did you feel as though that there were things coming from outside of you? And did you ever attribute those things to the fairies?
See, the problem is that I have come to understand this other thing as being such a hodgepodge grab bag of all sorts of different phenomena that I don't know if I ever said that it was fairies. If you wanted to identify it as fairy, then I'd be fine with that. But I don't know if in the moment I would do that. I would probably say something more along the lines of collective unconscious or something.
Yes.
But I think that those things might be interchangeable. I'm not sure. So, but I mean, but yeah, I did have a couple of moments like that. Like there was a very problematic section towards the end where I needed to solve a bit of a puzzle that I'd worked myself into, and it's one of those things that came to me on the verge of sleep. There was a chapter where Devlin and Rick meet that Barbara Fisher, my editor, came back to me. She's like, "This doesn't work. Like all your other chapters are fine, but this is the one that really sticks out as not working." And I sat down with it and rewrote it and redistributed it, and it wasn't the sense that I got it wrong. It was the sense that the transmission came through wrong. Like that was a very tangible sense. It was like, oh, it was always supposed to be this way. I just messed it up. You know, my wire was bent or something. The most tangible aspect that I experienced, and I've since confirmed that she does work there, so I can't say that it was literally a manifestation of some point, but I have another character in the book who's one of Rick's friends named Bora, and she works at a pharmacy. And one day I was picking up some medicines for my kids in the drive-through, and this woman, very closely matching Bora's description, appears at my pharmacy window. And like I said, I've since confirmed that she is indeed someone who works there, because for a while I didn't see her again, and I was like, oh, did I create her or something? But she was wearing, oddly enough, she was wearing this old like Soviet style Ushanka hat in March or something, like at a really weird time of year. And that actually made it that hat made it into the book as something that Bora wears. Yeah, there's definitely a give and take and sort of an interplay. Yeah.
So we should really have made this into a 3-hour epic, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And I'm just looked at the clock, and we're almost at an hour. It's and one thing I did want to talk about, but we're not going to have time for, so we're going to have you back at some point in the future.
Tell me when.
Is the near-death experience, which
Yes.
you were running course last year. I want to hear all about that, but I don't want to squeeze it into a few minutes, you know, at the end of the podcast. So keep that in your mind, because
Okay.
I've been reading, you must know, Michael
Oh
Grosso's
yeah.
Final Choice,
Yeah.
which sort of it's not totally about the near-death experience, but he does talk about it in a very sort of nice philosophical way, I think. And then of course I was thinking, right, Joshua, when we get him on the podcast, we'll have 20 minutes on the near-death experience. But here we are, and we haven't got time for that. So that's something to look forward to. But definitely before we go, we spoke briefly before we came on air about you having some experiences, and you said you might just briefly tell us about them. What's been going on? Surprise us, Joshua.
Yeah, well, they're the sort of experiences that I don't think a lot of people would necessarily appreciate as being that interesting, but in some sense they've been kind of tailor-made for me, because they have been things that I would have taken notice of. The short version of one of them was that I've met up with a lovely group of people who are paranormal investigators here in the Atlanta area, and we had an investigation that was at a home. And long story short, I was facing one of the investigators, and he saw a bluish pinpoint of light move from right to left above my head, and I saw a greenish bar of like grainy green laser light appear above his head. And we did some tests with windows and things in the room, and we cannot figure out exactly what that was. Which, again, not that all exciting for someone who sees fairies all the time or something like that. But for me, like, it's like, oh, finally something is happening again. But even more interesting than that, and especially esoteric in some regards, was I went out on a Bigfoot expedition in North Georgia with some folks in an area where they have a lot of activity pretty regularly. And I was I was disappointed for most of the night because nothing really happened. In fact, the organizers were a bit sort of baffled by that. But around the time that we were talking about nothing having happened, where in the was. It was in the middle of the national forest, but to get there, you had to go on a private road that only the organizers had access to. And so we're sitting around the campfire and we're sort of talking about all this stuff, and I hear a car door slam. And I say, "Did anybody else hear?" And someone else goes, "Yeah, a car door slammed right here." Wasn't any of the, no one was around the cars that we were at, that we had brought out there. Um, and that might seem like a really strange thing to hear in the wilderness until, you look through that old John Keel stuff. And
Yeah.
he said at one point that he had noticed that people would hear car doors slam in the
Yes.
wilderness, car doors slamming and babies crying. And that's something also that Ron Moorhead, who collected those Bigfoot vocalizations, said that they heard at the Sierra camp a lot, was the sound of a car door slamming, even though nobody was, there. So I was trying to sort of suss out, like, okay, well, that's cool for me. Like, again, it seems like it was just for me because most people have been like, oh, that was weird. But like for me, like, it's like, no, that's a John Keel thing.
Yeah.
I know exactly why that's important. But what occurred to me is like, so let's say that Keel was right, and the two things that you noticed most around monster sightings, and monster was his term for Bigfoot that he would use sometimes, are indeed infants screaming in the wilderness and car doors slamming. Well, number one, I think I would go to the bathroom in my pants if I heard an infant screaming in the woods. But like, it's pretty clear what that's kind of about. Like, we are hardwired to respond to that. Like, even if you don't like kids, there is something in your reptilian brain that is going to respond to that. And I was like, well, what is a car door slamming sound? And to me, like the sound of a car door symbolizes an arrival or a departure or an announcement of some sort. Like when I hear a car door slam, that's where my mind goes. It's like, oh, what has changed? Who is changing? Who is coming? Who is going? So, I don't know. Can't explain it. But it was interesting enough for me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe what's jumped to my mind about that is, though, maybe that's overcomplicating it. Maybe it's as simple as, that there are birds within nature who they'll mimic car alarms, or they'll mimic different sounds that they hear in their environment. Maybe it is a mimic of something that they associate with humans.
Right.
And if you're in the wilderness, you're not going to hear a lot from humans, but you will occasionally hear doors slamming on cars. And that pitch and frequency of a baby crying, like you say, is something that we all hear, no matter where our hearing range is. Most people do hear the crying of a baby. So maybe it's just a mimic.
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely possible. I mean, yeah, and there's some of what I did in Where the Footprints In with Tim Renner was to talk about, basically, if you can think of it, someone has supposedly said that Bigfoot can mimic it, to the extent that like Bigfoot sounds like a lyrebird. You've seen the videos of a lyrebird. So yeah, or a resonant echo across time. Any number of things, but something odd, and that's so I was sort of enthusiastic about my car door slamming in the woods.
And so you should be.
Well, yeah, and the obvious association, as you say, with Keel. Where he's specifically said that is very interesting what you say about, car door, it's an arrival or a departure. And I like to think that was Bigfoot messing around with you and mimicking a car door slamming.
Or saying, hey, this is what I want you to do. Get out of here.
Bugger off.
Tonight.
Yeah. See ya. We don't really want you around here.
So yeah, I've done a lot more I've done more field work probably in the past 6 months than I have my entire life. And
so
if you ever come over to the UK, you have got to come out spook hunting with me.
100%.
Yeah,
you won't be able to get rid of me. I'll be.
That's great. That's absolutely great.
I'll be the one doing the haunting.
You do realize that spook hunting in this country involves hanging out in freezing cold houses with not much happening.
That's not true. We have lots happen.
No, and this is kind of a nice way to maybe nice note to end things on. But like, I think so much of this process is about personal development. Like, I think that the study of UFOs is its own sort of alchemical transformation where suddenly I find things interesting that I never would have found interesting, And so it's all about the way that you reframe it. Like, you go out into the woods looking for Bigfoot, and you're really like being outdoors with a purpose. You're looking for UFOs and you're sky watching with a purpose. You're ghost hunting and you're spending time with people or in historical locations with a purpose. Like, that's the best way to sort of keep that frustration at bay, I think.
Yeah.
It's never quite when I'm there, Neil. Honestly. It's very rare that we have a quiet night when we're out on events.
Yeah, it's the freezing cold bit that always puts me off. That's,
No, it's
Yeah,
not.
well.
It's because he's afraid, Joshua. He's scared
Oh.
of the ghosts.
I've got thermal underwear. I can handle it.
Right,
What
so
what a note to go on.
what a note to end on. Joshua in his thermal underwear doing a
Yeah.
paranormal investigation. Absolutely fantastic. It's the sort of quality content you get on Hare and the Hawthorne.
Oh yes.
So right, well, thank you, Joshua. Like you say, these conversations I know it's a cliche to say, oh, time went by so quickly, but I just couldn't believe it when I looked at the clock. Hold on, we've only just started talking.
We just started, yeah, exactly.
And we could go on, and like I say, I really would like to have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation about NDEs. I think a lot of people on this channel will find that I find the whole phenomenon absolutely incredibly important and fascinating, but we don't want to just shoehorn it in for 5 minutes at the end of the conversation. So at some point in the future, whenever, maybe, when was the last time you were on? 18 months, maybe another 18 months, hopefully sooner.
Oh,
No,
sooner.
We'll do it sooner.
We'll do it.
I will. If we don't do it sooner, it's going to be on y'all as opposed to on me, because I'm ready to.
Yeah.
I'm ready
Okay.
to go. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we're delighted to hear that. And so, as usual, the last thing to say is, where can we find you, Josh?
JoshuaCutchin.com. JoshuaCutchin.com is the one-stop shop for future appearances, and all my interviews that I do are listed there, as well as all my books. You can even reach out to me depending on where you are. I've tried to send some stuff international when it's gotten lost, so I've stopped sending international packages when I can. But otherwise, if you're in the continental United States, I can send you an autographed copy of a book at a discount usually.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And can you get do the ebooks go out on your website?
The ebooks are just handled through Amazon.
Yeah. But,
part of the corporate machine, but
I'm afraid so. That's the way of things. Yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I think me and Neil nearly came to blows on a couple of occasions to try and get questions in there, which is always good when we have a guest that we can do that with. We'll fight it out later.
Well, it's been a delight with both of y'all, seriously.
That's brilliant. All righty, we'll end it there, and we'll have Josh back in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Okay. See you, everyone. Thank you, Josh.